Hey everybody, welcome to lesson 4. I decided to go with a college football motif in honor of all the frat boys out there in the corporate world. Now in this lesson I wanted to try giving you an alternative lens to use when looking at the global scene. Just like in lesson 1 of Renaissance 2.0, I said if you keep thinking that we live in a free republic, that you're going to be constantly frustrated because that just doesn't jive with reality in the US today. And when you have a disconnect between your mental framework and reality, that causes, confusion and frustration and psychological stress. And so I think it's useful to understand not only the country we live in, but also the world we live in. And if you're just listening to like the TV and the newspapers, the daily worthless noise we get, and we're trained to go to those sources for news, but it's all worthless news. It doesn't help because they suggest that the world is just a random array of countries where the governments have the power to act on the world scene. Well, if that's your lens, then you're going to have a hard time understanding things like, why are so many countries now in their banking systems at the point of collapse? Why is that a common trait across so many countries? Why are so many governments over their head in impossible debt? Does it make sense if every country is a random independent sovereign body? Why, for the last half of the 20th century, did the North and the West, why was that the region for economic growth and the East and the South were suppressed? Again, doesn't make sense if it's just random sovereign countries where politicians have the power. So I propose an alternative lens that you can use that's not necessarily, 100% true 100% of the time in 100% of the regions, but I think it's a useful lens to use when you find yourself confused and frustrated about what's going on and why, if you believe your individual country has power and the politicians there have the power to really change the world for you and the citizens of that country, then you're gonna be stressed out. So I would suggest viewing the world as a kind of something that has a central capital machine, and I'm going to call it the central heart of the overall global human body, human civilization, because money and liquidity is the blood that pumps through the system to keep the engine running. And most countries don't have their own autonomous monetary system. Some do, just so happens that those correlate nicely with the ones that get the focus of like intelligence agencies and militaries and things like that. But most countries don't have their own independent monetary system. Rather, there's this central capital machine. And people want me to name names here, but it's not about naming names. It's a system that incorporates and sucks so many people into it. There are institutions at the top like the World Bank, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, and then behind those are a lot of private capital, the biggest global capital pools in the world, multi-generational wealth, hidden in a bunch of LLCs you've never heard of, and equity partnerships and foundations and some of the hedge funds and stuff like that. And of course, it's not like all of these are cooperating nicely. There's competing factions within the machine. And then you have the senior capital behind the dominant banks that I've described. You have the global central banks themselves. You have the corporate system that's been built under the capital system. People are used to looking at the multinational corporations as those are the things moving into countries, taking over territory. But above the multinational corporations is the capital machine. You need the capital regulatory environment in order for corporations to move around within them. It's like, being on a football field, you need the rules of the field and the refs and everything to for the teams to have freedom to maneuver and play the game. Same thing with corporations. They need the game board on which they can play. And so this capital machine, they're the ones that determine that continually expand the game board as they try to move into new territories around the world. And then you have neoliberalism, the dominant economic philosophy in the US that's been used specifically for that purpose, to expand the game board, to justify breaking down national sovereignty, breaking down borders at the country level, so that the capital machine and the corporations under it have freedom to maneuver wherever they want. So despite all that, despite the fact that we see the global bond market, the global central banks, the global regulatory institutions, the dominant senior banks that operate multinationally, and the multinational corporations, and then the philosophy of neoliberalism that's been used to justify all of this. People will still say what I'm going to describe here isn't true. Well, good luck with trying to make sense of the world if you think that it's just a bunch of random independent countries, because it just doesn't fit with what we see on the world scene. And we see a manifestation of this capital machine, this central engine, at things like, the Economic Forum in Davos. You see the multinational corporate elites getting together and hobnobbing together, and that's a manifestation of the people that serve this machine. And a lot of them don't have a clue what they're doing. They're just getting nice paychecks. They've become billionaires because they're good salesmen. And they have no clue that it's all controlled by the top-down capital machine. And then you have, the types of people contributing to this. It's your average person in the corporate world, or like the top MBAs, people coming out of the top business schools that go to work for the dominant banks. They're serving this system. They have no idea strategically what they're doing. They're just getting the paycheck. They come right out of school and they get $200,000 a year. That's a nice incentive to serve this system. Same thing with the top law schools. The top graduates that go to the law firms that work for the banks. They don't necessarily know what they're doing, but they're building this capital machine and building the power around it that is becoming more powerful than countries. You go to New York and there's bank skyscrapers and there's the law firm skyscrapers, and they work together to create this system. And it's not just in New York. You go to, this capital is, the senior capital, like the capital firms that I mentioned, and the LLCs. There's a lot of it in like the Upper East Side of New York, but it's all over the world. There's a lot in San Francisco, a lot in Boston, a lot in London, Tokyo, Frankfurt, Paris. It's all over. But they're all aligned and integrated by the global bond market, the global central banking network. They've run the world for the latter half of the 20th century with this divide, where we had the North and the West that were pumped up and inflated, and then the East and the South that were suppressed. And this isn't mythology. This is the Federal Reserve primary dealer cartel that I've described in previous lessons and in articles. The primary banks in the U.S., the primary banks in Europe, and the primary banks in Japan. And then the dominant, British banks and other banks that have power in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Canada. So this is an integrated banking alliance that has pumped up this region. Like the dominant arteries, or the main aorta coming off the heart, has been pumping up through here and pumping out over there. So that's been inflated, while I would suggest interests associated with the capital machine or governments that are aligned with the capital machine have kept this region repressed. We've seen communism here in a different form of control now. Same thing with China. India, we literally saw the British Empire move in, try to take over with troops, but that didn't work. And then the capital machine moved in with banks. And 40 years ago, Indira Gandhi nationalized the banks to defend India from the invasion of the capital machine. But at the end of the day, it didn't work. It shows you the power of this machine. It just keeps coming and coming as it inflates and gets more powerful. At the end of the day, India has been subsumed into the machine. It's now part of the multinational corporate territory. Africa, we know the British Empire and other powers have fomented chaos there for a long time. Central and South America, same thing. We see a lot of chaos. We see a lot of cronyism. We know that the U.S. government has been involved with that, and Anglo-American financial institutions have been involved down there, overthrowing governments and stoking fear and chaos. So there's all different forms of maintaining control or preventing alternative power bases from forming. And this, the interests at the top of the capital machine here are kind of monopoly capitalists. They're not interested in competition. And it's been in their interest to maintain control over the large population, large landmass countries through the 20th century. That's the U.S., Germany, Russia, China, India, Brazil. And they've used different forms of top-down control in those regions. On this side of the world, We've had capitalism. And we're trained to think that's freedom, that's free market, kind of bottom-up free activity. Well, that ignores the monetary system. The economic schools that claim that this is freedom don't get it. Because we have 100% debt. 100% of the liquidity driven through this capitalism, this form of capitalism, comes from here. It's all top-down injected from the capital machine through big government and through big corporations. Those are the main control systems that they want to use. And as liquidity gets injected through those systems, that sucks a lot of people into working for those systems. Because if you want a decent wage, you have to go where the liquidity is. So that's why we've seen, in this version of capitalism, we've seen the destruction of Main Street, destruction of local communities, because the capital machine isn't interested in local community. They're interested in top-down control systems, hierarchical control systems like corporations and big federal government, not local community government. So this is a form of top-down control in the high-growth areas. And then in the area of the world where it's not high growth and it's kind of steady state because there's no arteries coming through it, it's just kind of small capillaries of capital that's allowed to circulate to maintain a subsistence level of population or a steady state economic system. And there's been multiple systems over here, but let's just say the most popular one is, or the most famous one, is communism. So that's another top-down control mechanism in a region where there's steady state activity.